Greetings, everyone. I'm Donna Seelbach, the president of the Episcopal Church Women in the Diocese of El Camino Real along the central coast of California. It's a joy to welcome all of you to our annual ECW Mary Lou Thompson retreat this year in virtual format. We are seeing many new faces due to our ability to reach out via Zoom technology. Who would have dreamed that we could come together from all parts of our diocese, as well as Province 8, and even our entire national ECW territory? This is perhaps the first time such a retreat has been offered with such a diverse potential for influencing a broader audience. I hope you all have accessed our link without too much effort. We look forward to exploring this venue for future community building for women in the Episcopal Church. Our speaker and facilitator for our retreat this morning is the Reverend Linda J. McConnell. Reverend Linda has been the rector of the Church of the Good Shepherd in Salinas, California for 10 years. She is the mother of 4 wonderful adults and 3, soon to be 4, superb grandchildren. The focus of her ministry has been on the inclusion of children and young people in the worship life of the church and the prophetic social message of the gospel that God's love and power is for all.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you for inviting me. I want to let you know how the day is going to go. Our retreat is organized around these 4 main components. Context, the context for suffrage, then seen through the lens of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a courageous voice for universal suffrage, through Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, and the power of dissent. And then finally, the current challenges to voting that need our continuing commitment. We're going to aim for a 5-minute stretch break around 11. We do have Crystal Gibbs, who is the administrator for Church of the Good Shepherd, with us as our technology expert. And she is going to help us both stay on mute to do breakout rooms if we decide to do that, and to make sure that we see what is in the chat box. My guest speakers also are going to be monitoring the chat box. If you don't know where the chat box is, if you can find it on your bar below, that is a place where you can put in thoughts, comments, questions. So we're expecting a lively use of the chat function. So I just want to ask if there are any questions right now for technology or how this is going to function. I'd like to welcome, I am so glad to be joined by 2 incredible women. Theresa Wright, she's the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Transportation Agency of Monterey County, formerly the Public Affairs Director for KSBW, passionate about suffrage and the role of African-American women in elections. I really thrilled to get to know Theresa. And Mary Adams, who is our 5th district supervisor for Monterey County. Mary has a 30-year career of public service solving problems for local families. She also happens to be a very good friend of our former Bishop, Mary Gray Reeves. So I'm very glad that Theresa and Mary are joining us today. We're going to begin with a prayer and a poem. So the Reverend Deacon Joan Anderson will lead us in a prayer.
Good morning. I'm so glad to be with everyone. Let us, for a moment, close our eyes, except I won't. But to gather our hearts and to just take a moment to center ourselves. Lord, we lift our voices. We lift our hands. We lift our lives up to you. We are an offering. Lord, use our voices. Lord, use our hands. Lord, use our lives. They are yours. We are an offering. All that we have, all that we are, all that we hope to be, we give to you. We lift our voices. We lift our hands. We lift our lives up to you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And Donna, that is a very, very much into the arts. She's going to bring us two poems today. The first one is We as Women.
Okay, hold on. Hold on, coming. This is a poem by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, suffragette. This was written in 1911. There's a cry in the air about us. We hear it before, behind, of the way in which we as women are going to lift mankind. With our white frocks starched and ruffled, with our soft hair brushed and curled, hats off, for we as women are coming to save the world. Fair sisters, listen one moment, and perhaps you'll pause for 10. The business of women as women is only with men as men. What we do, we as women, we have done all through our life. The work that is ours as women is the work of mother and wife. But to elevate public opinion and to lift up erring man is the work of the human being. Let us do it if we can. But wait, warm-hearted sisters, not quite so fast, so far. Tell me how we are going to lift a thing any higher than we are. We are going to purify politics and to elevate the press. We enter the foul paths of the world to sweeten and cleanse and bless. To hear the high things we are going to do and the horrors of men we tell, one would think we as women were angels and our brothers were fiends of hell. We that were born of one mother and reared in the self-same place, in the school and the church together, we of one blood, one race. Now then, all forward together, but remember, everyone, that 'tis not by feminine innocence the work of the world is done. The world needs strength and courage and wisdom to help and feed. When we as women bring these to man, we shall lift the world indeed.
Thank you. I just wanted to include this. This is a little, I want to say also that that was about lifting. The banner, you'll see later on a banner called Lifting as We Climb. That was the motto of the National Association of Suffrage for Colored Women. So Lifting as We Climb. This is a specimen ballot, for or against. We would all vote for, of course. So I was very, very happy when ECW asked me to lead this retreat on social justice and women and chose to narrow the focus on the vote because 2020 is the 100th anniversary. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was in 1920, so we're celebrating the 100th anniversary. The other reason is that we chose to focus on the vote is that we're on an extremely contested election year in which the right to vote is part of what is being contested. There have been unsubstantiated charges linking voter fraud to mail-in ballots, removal of ballot boxes, long lines, and waits to vote. Changes that primarily affect the poor, the elderly, and people of color. So the right to vote and the power of voting can never, ever be taken for granted. We're going to see how people fought and for decades to win the right to vote. The suffragette movement was the largest nonviolent revolution in the history of this nation. Well over half the population was enfranchised with the passage of the 19th Amendment. I did not know a lot about this when I started this, so I dove deep into the history. I know there are going to be people here. I know there are people here who know way more than I do, or Theresa does, or Mary does. We're well aware of that. So we're just barely scratching the surface today. And we welcome and want your comments on all of this. So anyway, going into the history, I got very inspired. The whole suffragist movement is kind of a miniature picture of how social change happens. It happens through courage, through perseverance, just keeping on. The baton, for instance, Charlotte Gilman, whose poem Donna read, died in 1911. She never saw the actual passage of the 19th Amendment. So this happened. People who were at Seneca Falls and before died before, not all of them, but some of them died before the passage. So social change is a process of passing the baton on to new leaders and new energy and new ways of doing things. It's about making alliances. It's about keeping joy and hope. There was so much singing and theater and costumes and all kinds of things that the suffragists used. They were extremely strategic also. They cultivated new leaders. There were also a lot of problems in the suffragette movement. They didn't really get what African-American women really got, the whole idea of intersection, class, race, gender, how all of these things function together. But that was a slow learning process for some of the suffragettes. And we're still learning that. So that's something to take into our future, is that we need to make common cause and not compete with one another. Just a little bit more about that. This is the official program of the suffrage procession in Washington, D.C. Isn't it gorgeous? That beautiful white horse with all its trappings, and that's Milholland. I can't think of her first name right now. Iris Milholland. In her flying cape and trumpet. The whole history of the suffrage movement is very interlinked with also abolition, temperance, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, the 14th Amendment, which we'll hear later on, Ruth Bader Ginsburg worked with a lot, the 14th Amendment, which gave the federal government power to enforce equality, and then the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to African-American men. All of these movements worked together. It's a fascinating period of American history, the late 1800s and early 1900s. Okay, so now we're going to see a little clip. This is about that Women's Suffrage Parade Centennial. So please enjoy.
On March 3rd, 1913, the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, over 5,000 women paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue toward the White House in a first-of-its-kind demonstration for the right to vote. As thousands watched, some of the women were insulted and attacked by a mob, resulting in over 200 injuries and the call for the U.S. Army cavalry to subdue the crowd. American History TV attended a centennial celebration of the event and interviewed participants and historians about the women's suffrage movement. The celebration was organized by Delta Sigma Theta sorority, which was founded in January of 1913.
on this day, March 3rd, 1913, they participated in the suffrage march for women to get the right to vote, even before African Americans had the right to vote. But they were visionary women who were social activists in their own day and time. As undergraduate students, they had to get a chaperone to leave campus, because if you remember 100 years ago, we didn't have freedom of movement as we have it now. Delta Sigma Theta was the only African American organization that participated in the original suffrage march 100 years ago.
Bishop Vashti Murphy McKenzie. I am the presiding bishop of the 10th Episcopal District of the AME Church, and that's the great state of Texas. Well, my grandmother, Vashti Turley Murphy, of course, was one of the 22 founders of Delta Sigma Theta sorority. At Howard University, she was a student, and she really believed in community service, and that's what our purpose is, our purpose in life. This is just an exciting day for us to be able to trace the footsteps of our founders, all of our founders, but it's just a great day for our family to be able to walk the same path that our grandmother walked.
I'm Paige Harrington, the director of the Sewell Belmont House and Museum.
I'm Elspeth Kirsch. I'm the Collections and Facilities Manager at Sewell Belmont.
Could you explain to viewers who don't know the history, how does what's happening here compare to what happened here 100 years ago?
The most striking difference between what's happening today and what happened 100 years ago is the calmness of the parade. 100 years ago, the parade wasn't a parade so much as a riot. The police refused to protect the marchers. And so as the marchers progressed down their planned parade route, the crowds got larger and larger. They were very unruly. They'd been drinking. They started to throw things at the women. They shouted things. They told them to go home. And a riot broke out. And not just that, streetcars continued to empty people into the already packed crowds. And so the crowd got larger and larger and more aggressive. And so the women couldn't go forward. The police weren't involved. In fact, the Secretary of Defense called out the Fort Myer Cavalry to push back the unruly crowd so that the women could continue their peaceful exercise of their First Amendment rights.
At the end of the day, over 100 women had to go to the hospital because of their injuries.
Mm-hmm. Whereas today, this is a wonderful, peaceful assembly and a celebration of how far we've come in 100 years.
Exactly.
This was the first time a civil rights parade occurred in Washington. And what's so remarkable about this is Alice Paul was down here with the delegation of NASA, which had been pushing for women's suffrage on a state-by-state basis. But what you see with this parade is the movement towards a push for a federal amendment to the Constitution. And it's the start of the real it's the start of the movement that really drove us to the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote.
What was the status of the state-by-state effort at that point?
At that point, 10 states had given women the right to vote, and the movement was sort of stagnating. It lost a lot of steam during the Civil War because protesting a sitting president was seen as unpatriotic, what makes what Alice Paul did all the more inflammatory and significant, because shortly after the 1913 parade, you get into World War I. And so Alice Paul and the NWP picketed Wilson with Wilson's own words on the banners that they held in front of the White House, the first group to picket in front of the White House, which we now consider to be so common.
It is. At that point, the women were actually jailed. They were jailed for obstructing traffic because they were picketing in front of the White House. They were sent to Occoquan Workhouse. They were not allowed to see their families nor communicate with their families. Several of them were kept in solitary confinement. They were beaten, they were thrown to the ground, they were given food, oatmeal with worms in it, and they were living under very deplorable conditions. And public sentiment started to turn, and people started to realize that the women were fighting for something that was just and should be pushed through. And at that point, President Wilson was able to be brought on board, and the 19th Amendment was ultimately passed as a war measure. So they saw it as a way to unite the country, men and women, to continue fighting for democracy abroad. The majesty of the original parade was amazing. Inez Milholland rode on a white horse and led the marchers down Pennsylvania Avenue. There was a group of about 5,000 women that marched. And as Elspeth said, it quickly turned into a riot. And so the majesty of the afternoon was lost. So today we're celebrating, which is wonderful to be able to come together with so many women's organizations, including the Deltas, and become a part of this again today.
Alice Paul chose the date very deliberately. It was March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson took his first oath of office for his first inauguration as president. So the city was full of people who were here to see the president. And one of the most wonderful things in the Sewell Belmont collection is a book that has two photographs side by side. One on the left has the women marching with bedlam raining all around. And then on the right, you see the orderly military style parade that took place the next day for President Wilson's inauguration. It's incredibly striking.
If we go back to the parade in 1913, what was the immediate reaction after that, the public?
The headlines for the newspapers immediately after the parade are incredible. They say things like, parade full of galaxy of suffrage beauties assaulted on street corners. I mean, the headlines we would consider to be just ridiculous. But the public sentiment was really part of it underwent an incredible shift. And so before, suffrage was considered this movement of old women who were spinsters and unattractive and unintelligent. And now with this parade, the newspapers saw the suffrage movement as headed by young, vibrant, intelligent, engaged women. Educated is really important. Educated women who wanted to take their rightful place in a democracy.
If you compare the way the city and the police handled what happened then to now, was that sort of the beginning of the change of how protests are handled?
Absolutely. When Alice Paul applied for the protest permits to march in Washington, D.C., she actually couldn't get an audience with the D.C. superintendent of police until very shortly before, and he refused to turn off the streetcars. And so they continued to disgorge people into the already packed crowds. And so people just kept pushing and pushing and pushing in. Now, as a result of the terrible injuries that happened that day, the police know that they need to block off streets and stop transit and prevent additional people from pushing against a crowd that's watching a march.
On March
there's so many things to find, but that's a really nice showing of, how far we've come, at least in terms of civil rights parades. I'm going to turn it over now to Theresa Wright, who is going to lead us in just an exploration of one of the African-American women who was very powerful, Ida B. Wells.
Linda, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. And I'm really pleased to be here. And, watching that clip, it was just hit home to me because in our public education system, a lot of our history is lost and it's not taught. And so that's the first time that I saw that video. And it just gave me a different perspective of sororities, particularly Black sororities, and the role that they play. I've heard it. I have friends who are members. But again, to me, it drives home the intersection that you were talking about the fact that we have so much in common that we have to break through those barriers that separate us. And this was a great example of that. So what I'd like to do is take it over and talk about the African-American suffragists and talk about racism and sexism and owning their own power, which to this day, you see that demonstrated where African-American women are owning their own power, particularly when we start talking about election and the right to vote. So as you saw in that clip, African-American women made the passage of the 19th Amendment possible, but were often neglected and their recognition and the critical role that they played. They were often excluded, you heard about that, but these women were determined, as you see that they're determined today, and they did not let that stop them. So what we'd like to do is just to show you this little video clip here, and Linda, I'll let you start it. It gives you a little bit of perspective of these women securing their right to vote. So go ahead and take a look.
Oops, sorry.
So let's talk about Ida B. Wells, one of the women that you saw portrayed there, and someone who was definitely important in this movement. You go on to the next slide.
Should we start that?
Yes, please, a clip of her biography.
Ida B. Wells was born in 1862 in the middle of the Civil War in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which was actually contested territory and being claimed by the Confederates and then by the Union. She lived through really tumultuous times. She was also orphaned at an early age. Her parents were killed in the yellow fever epidemic of the 1870s that swept through the Mississippi Valley. And she was left at 16 years old to take care of her 5 surviving brothers and sisters. After her parents passed, their friends were going to take the children and split them up, and I did not want this to happen. She became a teacher essentially to support her brothers and sisters and keep the family together. She's only 16, but she had basic education, which was enough in those days to teach at a rural country school where she'd educate Black children. She had a lot of responsibility at an early age, and she managed to somehow rise to it. Wells seems to have been a sort of natural feminist from the beginning. She never really seemed to see any reason why she couldn't do everything a man could do. And the fact that she had to support her brothers and sisters from an early age may have sort of shaped her idea of herself as someone who was, sort of head of a family. By the early 1880s, Ida had moved to Memphis, and she was still teaching in rural schools. So she was traveling back and forth to work on what was then a newfangled thing, which was a train. One day, she took her seat in what was then known as the ladies' car. It was the second car on the train. They typically only had 2, and they were reserved for women. They were non-smoking, they were sometimes more comfortable, and Wells had ridden in them previously, but this particular day, she was told that she could not sit in it. She insisted that she could. She had bought a ticket for that car, and she ended up having an enormous fight with a conductor. He tried to pull her out physically. She bit him. They cast her out. She got a ride home in a wagon and immediately sued the railroad. Her suit wound through the courts for several years. In the lower courts, she won. The judge said that she was a respectable looking person. She was in fact a lady, so there's no reason why she shouldn't ride in the ladies' car. But when it got to the state Supreme Court, she lost. Tennessee was in the process of implementing segregation during this time, which really took shape after the Civil War, so she couldn't win. She was devastated by not winning, but it turned her into an activist. That was sort of the beginning of her activism. And it was also the beginning of her being a journalist, because she wrote up her experience in a church newspaper called The Living Way. Ida B. Wells was not alone. There were a few Black women journalists during her time, but she was distinctive in the fact that she wrote about a variety of subjects. She didn't just write for the women's page. She was political independent. She weighed in on things like disenfranchisement and segregation and so forth. She rapidly became really the most prominent Black female journalist. She actually wrote during her early years under the pen name Iola, which she chose as a sort of countrified name to evoke her rural upbringings and speak to the fact that she wanted to speak to the common people. She wanted to speak to everyone. She was known for being very outspoken and lively. She got this nickname Iola, Princess of the Press. Wells became a leader in anti-lynching and essentially almost invented it, I would say, because of a sort of terrible personal experience she had. It was a terrible lynching in Memphis in which 3 Black men were killed. And one of them was a man named Thomas Moss, a local businessman, as well as the local mailman, who was a friend of Wells along with his wife. Wells is out of town when this happens, and she comes back to find Black people fleeing Memphis, her friend Thomas dead along with 2 other men. She had been thinking that, she would live in the South and she would work to make it a better place. But when she looked at someone like Thomas Moss, who had been devout churchgoer, taught Sunday school, invested in his own business, done everything that the sort of world said that Blacks needed to do to get ahead, and then had ended up being lynched, she began to question whether you could really do anything in the South. She published an editorial that went essentially too far in saying all this, and a white mob stormed the office of the Free Speech and destroyed the printing press. Wells was fortunate she wasn't there, but the mob left a note basically telling whoever was printing the newspaper that they should leave town and putting a death threat. She ended up in New York, where she was hired by T. Thomas Fortune, the publisher of the New York Age, and led what was basically sort of the first anti-lynching campaign, where she identified lynching as a crime and was trying to push the government and social reformers to take action about it. Anti-lynching would become a major commitment for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it would also be a major commitment of Black women's clubs and other civil rights organizations.
Thank you, Linda. So just to put things a little in context, I'd like to go over some of the information that's on this slide. African-American women have been advocating for abolition and women's rights since 1830s. So after the Civil War, they battled segregation and racism within the movement. And think about that for a second, what that means. Within the own movement, where there's everybody's bonding together about the cause, they still have to fight against segregation and racism. So for them, the fight was about equal rights, but not solely defined by gender or by race. And as the author and speaker Frances Ellen Watkin Hopper explained, white women must factor African-American women's double burden of sex and race into claims for women's rights and suffrage. And I'm going to stop there for just a second, and just on a personal note, that's a double burden that's to this day, right? We're talking about the 1830s. But to this day, that's still a standard that African American women fight against all the time. Ida B. Wells, as you heard, was a journalist, anti-lynching activist, and she co-founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago in 1913. And famously, as you saw in that clip, the women refused to march in the segregated section of the suffrage parade that same year in Washington, D.C. So again, within the movement, when they showed up for that march, they were told, yeah, you're here, but go to the back of the parade. And they said, no, that's not what we're going to do. So that just truly illustrates why, you know, within the movement, there's still reluctance for acceptance. So let's talk a little bit about the Black Women's Club, the vehicle for change. And I believe that could be the next slide. Towards the end of the 19th century, Black women organized themselves into women's club, and that was used as a vehicle to accomplish their aims for change and reform. The National Association of Colored Women, with Mary Church Terrell as its first president, formed in 1896. Now, many of these women joined the local women's club and further organized at the national level. Black Women's Club became central to the reform of and support for women's suffrage. On the national level, African American women's suffrage mobilized developed with the formation of the National Black Women's Club movement, where suffrage became an agenda item. Their political impact was formidable. The NACW maintained a suffrage department. I think we have a photo that's coming up here, and these are the 9 African American women. And this is a photo in that day, but I find it really moving because even though we're talking about something 100 years ago, basically, these women are still playing a role today. I don't know if you will recall the news stories, but after Joe Biden announced that Kamala Harris was his running mate, she is a Delta. And those women came out, celebrated, and said, we've got her back. And we are not going to stand silent at the pushback against her, the things that they knew that were going to come, the sexist, racist attacks that were going to come against her. And you see it coming out of the White House even. These women took a stand and said, no, we're not going to stand for that. So you see that even though this movement started over 100 years ago, African American women still play a critical role in our democracy and our ability to vote even today. And so I thought this is a moving photo, and it probably took a lot of courage for those women to stand there, as you see in that time. And here we are today, still having to fight, still having to stand together to guarantee the fact that we have a right to vote, when actively to this day, there are efforts that are ongoing to make sure that we don't have the right to vote as women, as African Americans. And so I'm personally touched by that photo there. Next, please. Linda, I believe you referred to this earlier, lifting as we climb, the banner. And this is that banner that she was making reference to. And so when we start talking about the Alpha Suffrage Club in Illinois, the presidential and municipal suffrage bill passed in December of 1913, where it offered state electoral power to women. African American women were ready, because this was primarily due to the creation of the first and one of the most important Black female suffrage organizations in the state and the city, which was the Alpha Suffrage Club. It was established in January 1913 by a Black club women and anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells Barnett, who we heard about, and white activist Belle Squire. The club published a newsletter to educate the Black community about issues and candidates on the ballot. They held monthly meetings, claimed nearly 200 members by 1916, and issued the newsletter, The Alpha Suffrage Record, registered thousands of Black women voters, and endorsed candidates. The club is most recognized for its pivotal role in the 1915 election of the first African American alderman in Chicago, Oscar DePriest.
Shall I play this?
Yes, please. Take a look at this. Knocking on the Doors, Ida B. Wells. Thank you. So before we take a break, and we are talking about respectful communications here, do you mind, Cynthia, if you don't mind unmuting yourself? Cynthia had a couple of comments, and I'd like her to go ahead and share them. And one of them, I think, is probably something I misspoke on. So Cynthia, do you mind just sharing your comments?
Not at all, Theresa. Thank you. Just on a personal note, in high school, we learned about Ida B. Wells. And I'm sure I daydreamed as much as any high school kid did during class, but I would swear we learned only about her connection with the anti-lynching crusade. This is the first I'm learning much about her as a suffragist. That's just a personal note.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And then you also had another comment about the sorority, and you could very well be right about that. I could have misspoken. So why don't you go ahead and share that comment?
One noticed during the primary presidential debates that the first, looked to me like the first couple of rows, front row seats at all of those debates were taken up by Kamala Harris's Kappa Delta sisters, or unless I'm now learning, unless those women were Deltas.
And I'll be honest with
what
you,
you said about her.
Yeah, I'm not sure if they were Deltas or Kappas, but I think that the thing that for me that resonates is the fact that they are sororities, and the importance of sororities and what it is that their mission, what it is that they do. So I was very much struck by that, and the fact that she totally embraced it. You could see the delight on her face and their faces in that moment. So yeah, that was really cool, and I thank you for sharing your comments. Okay, so Linda, did you want to take over at this point?
Sure. I thank you, Theresa, again. So we just want to give some time here before a break for some discussion, and we can either break out into small rooms or do this as a whole. And I think I'm going to stop sharing now, so that I just wanted, this is called Respect. It was developed for small groups by Eric Law, who does a lot of work in multicultural work within the church. But he uses this word respect and breaks it down to take responsibility for what you're saying and feel without blaming others. So that's R for responsibility, E for empathetic listening, S for being sensitive to differences in communication styles, P to ponder what you hear and feel before you speak, E, examine what you hear and feel before you speak. So in other words, like take a little minute to ponder and examine. C, to keep confidentiality. And T, to trust ambiguity. We're not, it's not about celebrating who's right and who's wrong. Paradox. So I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can kind of see one another on the screen, our beautiful faces. So there's 8 comments in the chat section. Does anyone have something that they would like to share? Some thoughts? Donna, I believe, is waving her hand.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say that so much of what these women through continued into 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And in 1976, there was a second women's convention in Houston, Texas. And the delegates, of which I happen to have the honor to be one from the state of California, were a real diverse group. That was a requirement, that each state had to have diversity in their delegation. And later on, I'll tell you a little bit more that's kind of heartening about what happened at that convention. The second women's convention, first one was Seneca Falls, of course, but the second one. But this was as late as 1976. So.
Thank you.
Hate to break it, but we're now on our 50th anniversary of these great events of the 1970s.
Yes, yes.
Anyone else have any thoughts that they would like to share? Crystal, I'm going to count on you to see if people are raising their hands or.
Not seeing any hands on. Yeah, Mary.
Mary.
Mary does.
You'll have to unmute.
Thank you. I must say, I just felt and found that Theresa's presentation was so incredibly important. I really, I had not seen a lot of the clips that were discussed, but it simply underscored for me the importance of African American women in elections as we see them today. Without question, African American women have been sort of the bellwether of how the political election process, essentially, rather the process, but who's voting for whom goes. So to see the background and the history of this and presented in such a beautiful way, Theresa, was just very helpful and very personally moving for me. I knew about it, but to know the genesis, it was marvelous. And I really thank you for the way that you brought everything forward. It was really, really well done. So I appreciate it and I appreciate you.
Thank you, Mary. I do appreciate that. And I just have to say thanks to Linda because she really pulled all of this stuff together. She deserves a lot of recognition for this effort. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Theresa, you were sharing with us some personal experiences from your mother and grandmother.
Yeah, sure. We had a meeting last night, the three of us, and so we were just talking over the presentation. And I was sharing with them the importance of the vote. You know, I always voted. It just was unquestionable. There was never any doubt that the people in my household, we grew up and we voted. And for me, it's personal because I recognize the history of my ancestors not having the right to vote, and then people dying and fighting for the right to vote. So for me, it's very personal when I hear people who choose not to vote. I take that as, it's like a personal wound to me because I think that there are so many countries where people can't vote and fighting to vote, and the fact that somebody here actively chooses not to exercise that right. And so I was sharing about how my grandmother, who, you know, because of the circumstances of their life, one of my grandmothers, if any of you saw the movie The Help, I mean, that was her life story, right? She raised generations of family members of this one family, and it was striking. I mean, it was in the South, and so you can imagine she lived to be nearly 100, and you can imagine the things that she saw during her lifetime. So the fact that she did not live to see Barack Obama become president. She was right on the cusp of being here when he was elected. And I just remember feeling so wounded by the fact that she didn't live to see that moment. And I think about all the opportunities that had circumstances been different. She was an amazingly smart, intelligent woman, and she could have been an innovator, an entrepreneur, because she had so little and she did so much with the little bit that she had, and she figured out how to invent things to make her life better, you know, just really small little things within the house that we would go visit her, and I'd be amazed by that. And I think about all the lost opportunity that women, and particularly women of color, could have, and the important role that they can play in our country just by having the right to vote, just by having an equal opportunity. And so to me, that's why the vote is so valuable, because that's where it starts. And to think that somebody chooses not to use that option, that right that's so hard earned. And so as we go forth, 2020, this election that's coming up, you actively see there's no hiding. People are so emboldened. They're not even trying to hide the fact that they're doing everything to suppress the vote, to make sure ballots are not counted, to make sure that people are disenfranchised. And I think I love that poem, Donna, that you read earlier, the one where it says, "We are women." There are two lines in there that I wrote down, and I thought I'm gonna find this poem and I'm gonna print it up because I really loved it. But the line that said, "We as women are coming to save the world." And then later on near the end, there was a little part that says, we shall lift the world indeed. And I honestly believe in that. I believe if we are going to change things in this country, it's the women who are going to do it. We have seen the leadership that men have had in this country. We have seen where it's led us. And if we are going to come out of this mess, it's going to take women standing up. It's going to take women united, getting past our differences, getting past our racial backgrounds, getting past our cultural backgrounds, our class backgrounds, women uniting together to lift up this world, to lift up this country. And so it starts with the vote, and it starts with us giving voice to our power and making sure that we win the right to vote and to maintain it. So to me, it's personal.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Theresa, for that. Cynthia, did you have your hand raised? You'll need to unmute.
Josephine is a African-American Salvation Army minister who frequently came into the county jail, and I'm speaking of the Monterey County Jail at Salinas. If Josephine is not 90, she is pretty close to it. And she was coming into the jail one afternoon as I was leaving, and of course it was 2016. What else is there to talk about but the upcoming election? Josephine was very distressed. She didn't really like either candidate. And she said to me, for a long moment, I was ready to say, well, I just won't vote. And then she said, but chaplain, she said, and she made a fist. I can remember the fist. She said, but then I remembered, no, my people have gone through too much to acquire the right to go to the ballot box. And I'm not going to give that one up.
Thank you. And Joan, you'll have to unmute.
No, I just wanted to share, especially I guess with Theresa too, but that a woman who is a daughter of the king, to which I belong, and she's around my age, which is 80, worked this year in the South because she had actually been in the South with John Lewis and Martin Luther King, and there that day on the bridge.
Oh.
She was working to register people to vote until the CDC said, you gotta stay home. But my heart just swells with pride when I think about her and gratitude for the work that she so bravely does. So.
Yeah, and even at her age, right? She's still on the battle lines, even at her age.
So African-American women are working for sure.
Yeah.
They set us quite a pace to follow.
Yeah. Cindy,
thank you, Theresa.
Cindy, you're welcome. Cindy sent the link to everyone for the poem. So Cindy, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
And thank you to Donna for bringing that poem to us. Donna's going to have another poem that we will, I believe I put it right as we come back from a little break. So we're going to take a little break right now, just about a 5-minute break. So you can, stretch your legs. I know we're all at home. While we're taking a break, we're going to be moving into Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And there's memes, all kinds of memes about Ruth Bader Ginsburg out now, but I just have a fun little clip for you to watch or not watch. It's Stephen Colbert went to do a workout with, Stephen Colbert is a comedian, of course, right? So this is a little irreverent, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her 80s was known for her workouts. So this is just a fun thing to enjoy. And Joan, do you still want to say something? Okay, I think her hand is just still up, but I'm going to share the screen again. And Here we are taking a break. All right, so welcome back so we're going to go from the ridiculous to the sublime. This is a poem that, again, our president of the local chapter of ECW, Donna Seelbach, is going to share with us from, again, Charlotte Perkins, and she'll have to unmute.
The title of this poem is Coming. Because the time is ripe, the age is ready. Because the world her women's help demands. Out of the long subjection and seclusion come to our field of warfare and confusion, the mother's heart and hands. Long has she stood aside, endured and waited, while man, swung forward, toiled on alone. Now for the weary man, so long ill-mated, now for the world for which she was created, comes the woman to her own. Not for herself, though sweet the air of freedom, not for herself, though dear the newborn power, but for the child who needs a nobler mother, for the whole people needing one another, comes woman to her hour.
Thank you. I've had to move because a wood chipper started up outside very loud. So this is Ruth Bader Ginsburg from 1977. I am not an attorney, so approaching this was a bit daunting. I called my friend Vanessa Vallarta, who's a Monterey County Superior Court judge, to get her help on this. So the way I've organized it is due to Vanessa, and I give her thanks. She helped me get my arms around how to think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But at the heart of her legacy is this radical project to erase the functional differences between men and women in society. She said that women's rights are an essential part of human rights. For women, this is a quote by Abby Gluck, a Yale Law School professor who was also a clerk for Ginsburg. She says, for women, she was the most important legal advocate in human history because she changed the way that the law sees gender. She argued in 1971, there's a case called Reed versus Reed. The Supreme Court ruled for the first time ever that the law that discriminates against women is unconstitutional under that 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment was part of the Reconstruction Amendments that gave the federal government power to enforce equality. And we'll see that coming around again in a later decision that we'll talk about later on. But this was the first time she used the 14th Amendment to argue that there was discrimination based on sex. Kind of astonishing, it's only been 50 years, and that it was only 50 years ago that the Supreme Court recognized constitutional equality for women. This is a trailer for the movie RBG, which I recommend, but just enjoy this 3 minutes.
I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
We welcome today Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's become such an icon.
Do you mind signing this copy?
I am 84 years old and everyone wants to take a picture with me.
Notorious RBG. Yeah, yeah.
When you come right down to the closest thing to a superhero I know.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg changed the way the world is for American women.
I became a lawyer when women were not wanted by the legal profession.
Thousands of state and federal laws discriminated on the basis of gender. She was following in the footsteps of the battle for racial equality. She wanted equal protection for women.
Men and women are persons of equal dignity and they should count equally before the law.
She captured for the male members of the court what it was like to be a second-class citizen.
The point is that the discriminatory line almost inevitably hurts women.
I did see myself as kind of a kindergarten teacher in those days because the judges didn't think sex discrimination existed.
I have had the great good fortune to share life with a partner truly extraordinary for his generation.
He was the first boy I ever knew who cared that I had a brain.
She is a center of power on and off the court.
Every time Justice Ginsburg wrote a dissent, the internet would explode.
I came up with a couple of slogans. You can't spell truth without Ruth.
I surely would not be in this room today without the determined efforts of men and women who kept dreams alive.
I've heard that she does 20 push-ups 3 times a week or something. I mean, we can't even get off the floor. We can't even get down to the floor.
That's true.
I ask no favor.
All right. There's a lot that we have today that we just take for granted, but these are 6 laws that Ruth Ginsburg championed to support gender equity. First, that employers can't discriminate based on gender or reproductive choices. In other words, if you're pregnant, you can't be fired. Or if you're going to potentially become pregnant, that can't factor into hiring decisions. You know, that's hard to enforce, but pregnancy discrimination is outlawed. State-funded schools must admit women. This was a very famous court case that she did against with Virginia Military University. So any school that receives state funds has to also admit women. I did not know that women could not open a bank account, get a credit card, sign a mortgage without on their own. Didn't know that because I've always assumed that we could. But that was because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that we can have a bank account, credit card, have a mortgage all in our own name, have equal right to our pensions. She wasn't just about women. She was truly about gender equality. And so she often argued cases on behalf of men. Entitlement for men equally to women as well. I did also not know that she was the one who said that no juries have to include women. And then the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act it was only signed, equal pay for equal work was only signed in 2009 by Barack Obama. This was based on one of her dissents. So her dissents, she wrote them in such a way to look towards the future, to give legislators a path forward to correcting whatever the court was finding to be a problem. So Lilly Ledbetter was discovered that she was being paid much less than her male counterparts. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against her. Because of Ruth Ginsburg's dissent, she paved the way for that legislation to pass in 2009. So I want to talk just a little bit about her mother, Celia Bader. Celia Bader, where they were she was the daughter of immigrants. And she was incredibly smart. She graduated high school when she was 15, but she was then had to go to work in the garment district to support her brother, so that her brother, who was not nearly as good a student as Celia, but she supported her brother to go to Cornell. She married young, as women did in that age. She had 2 children. The older child died of meningitis, and then Ruth. She set aside money every single week out of the funds that her husband gave her to run the household. She set aside a small portion for Ruth's college education. She died the day before Ruth graduated from high school. But that money that she'd been setting aside added up to $8,000, which in today's terms is $86,000 for Ruth to go to college. Now she had a full ride to full scholarship to Cornell. But that was the kind of woman that raised Ruth, and her 2 mottos were: be independent, take care of yourself without being financially beholden to a man, and be a lady. Now, by be a lady, she meant that do not allow your emotions, particularly your negative emotions, particularly anger, to get a hold of you. Step back, take a breath, and then speak calmly and do something to change the situation. The other person that I want to talk about is her husband, Marty Ginsburg, because they married shortly after they met at Cornell, and they were committed to an equality in their marriage. These are the two, her mother and Marty were 2 of the things that really made her life diverge from a lot of women in her generation. He was a nationally known tax attorney. Ruth was not able to even get a job, even though she graduated at the very top of both Harvard and what's her second? Columbia. Nobody would hire her, not just because she was a woman, but because she was also a mother. They had a child. She had a 14-month-old child when she went into law school. She put Marty through law school in the fact that he got testicular cancer shortly thereafter. She took not only her own notes, but his notes, got them typed up, cared for him, cared for their daughter, and graduated at the very top of her class. But Marty paved the way for her to get jobs, and basically to be nominated into the Supreme Court. When they were married in Marty's parents' apartment, and her mother-in-law took her aside on her wedding day and said, "I want to tell you the secret to a happy marriage is to just be a little bit deaf." and Ruth said that not only helped her marriage, but helped with her current colleagues on the court. She was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1933. She got her BA from Cornell, attended Harvard Law, and received her degree from Columbia. The treatment that she received there really honed her feminist instincts. She was only one of 9 women at Harvard Law. The dean invited her and her 8 other classmates to dinner at his home. And at that dinner, took them one by one and asked them one by one what they could contribute that would justify their taking a man's seat in the law class. I've already said that she couldn't get a job, so she ended up being a professor of law. And She was also a founder. She went to work for the ACLU. She was a founder of the Women's Rights Project at ACLU. And that's where she litigated so many of those laws that I talked about earlier. She says she deliberately chose the ACLU rather than a women's rights organization because she felt like civil liberties and civil rights should be a broad umbrella that included women's rights, but not only women's rights. She wanted to be a part of the general human rights agenda. She served on the Supreme Court for 27 years and died at the age of 87. That's Marty holding the Bible for her as she is sworn in as a Supreme Court justice. This is an interview with Gwen Ifill, and it's a little segment on just becoming the notorious RBG. So we won't watch the whole thing, but I just, these are two icons, Ruth and Gwen.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg broke countless barriers for women in the legal profession long before she was tapped by President Bill Clinton for the highest court in the land. Now she's published a collection of her writings and speeches called My Own Words. For this latest addition to the NewsHour bookshelf, Gwen Ifill sat down with Justice Ginsburg recently at the Supreme Court.
Justice Ginsburg, thank you for speaking with us. I want to start with a broader question than you even address in your book, which is, you've become something of a folk hero to some women. Did you see that coming?
It is utterly amazing. Of course I didn't see it coming. And it was all the creation of a second-year law student at NYU. It came about this way. She was reading the court's decision that invalidated a very significant part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And she was angry. And then she remembered that I had said, anger is a useless emotion. It doesn't get you anyplace. Do something positive. So she created this Tumblr, starting with my dissent. And then it took off into Wild Blue Yonder.
You know, some people would say it's about politics, but I wonder if it's not also about your presence, your very existence on the court, and the way that you write and the way that you sometimes take on your colleagues.
I would like to think so, but I certainly was given a tremendous boost into the public arena by the notorious RBG. When I was asked about it, I said, well, it's exactly right, because notorious B.I.G. and I had something in common. You did? What? We were both born and bred in Brooklyn, New York.
You ever considered being a rapper?
I don't think I have that talent.
Well, neither do I. I want to talk to you about someone you give a lot of credit to in this book, and that's your late husband, Marty Ginsburg. And one of the things that someone said is that you would never have been on the court without him. Do you agree with that?
It's absolutely true. One of my law clerks at the Court of Appeals said at the time that Clinton was considering who would be his first nominee to the court, he said, you will be on the list, but you'll probably be around number 25 unless you do something to promote yourself. So I'm not very good at promotion, but Marty was. And he was tireless in his effort to see that I would be the nominee.
Just the way you write about and speak about Marty, it's almost like a present tense presence in your life.
He will be present in my life as long as I live. I have his portrait in my bedroom, and I look at it and say, you would probably like what I'm doing now.
Out of all the speeches and the writings that you've collected in this book, what do you get the most frequent questions about? What do young people, older people ask you?
One question is, did you always want to be a judge? Or more exorbitantly, did you always want to be a Supreme Court justice? I try to explain the way things were in the not so good old days. So when I graduated from law school in 1959, there was not a single woman on any federal bench. It would not be a realistic ambition for a woman to want to become a federal judge. It was not realistic until Jimmy Carter became our president. He looked around at the federal judiciary and said, that's nice, but they all look like me. So I am determined to appoint members of minority groups and women in numbers to the federal bench. So we will use the talent of all of the people of the United States and not just some of them.
I'm not sure everyone knows how extensive your interest in women's issues, women's rights, were long before you got to the court. Is that something which this can also begin to illuminate?
Yes, the book includes one of my many speeches about why we need an equal rights amendment.
Do you feel that as a liberal, that conservative women, men can identify with you as well?
The label liberal or conservative, every time I hear that, I think of the great Gilbert and Sullivan song from Ireland. It goes, every gal and every boy that's born alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. What do those labels mean? It depends on whose ox is being gored.
You got into a little trouble for me. Ruth.
So I want to move us now into a specific area of voting that was the reason that she became this meme of the notorious RBG. Shelby County versus Holder. What that was in 2013, the Supreme Court said that a key provision of the landmark civil rights law of 1965 had become unnecessary. That states that had a deep history of discriminatory practices, so that they needed to get federal clearance before making changes to the voting requirements. They said that that was no longer necessary, and so they struck it down. I had spoken earlier about the 14th Amendment. This was another way. First was gender equality, building on the 14th Amendment, and now the Civil Rights Act of 1965, built also on the 14th Amendment, gave the federal government enforcement powers to ensure that all people are treated equally under the law for voting. Shelby County, this decision kind of defanged the federal enforcement powers. Here she is talking about why this was what she calls the worst ruling.
The worst case, I think, was the Voting Rights Act case. That passed Congress overwhelmingly. I think it was unanimous in the Senate and 330 some odd votes in the House. If anyone knows about the voting rights, how it affects the system, I think the elected representatives have an appreciation of that the unelected judges don't have. And yet, despite the overwhelming majority in Congress that passed the Voting Rights Act, the court said it won't do. The formula is out of date, so Congress would have to go back and take this. The Voting Rights Act passed originally in 1965 on Johnson's, during Johnson's tenure. It was renewed by Nixon, Ford, both Bushes. And it was the second Bush, it was the most recent extension. But the court said it won't do. So I think that's an example of striking down legislation on a subject that the people in the political arena are better informed about than the court is.
So I want to just talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act before we get into the current challenges to voting that follow directly from that decision of the Shelby County. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 to really ensure that the 15th Amendment would actually come to pass. It was an act to enforce that 15th Amendment that was signed into law 95 years before. So in those 95 years, African Americans in the South faced tremendous obstacles to voting: poll taxes, literacy taxes, bureaucratic measures that were designed to deny them the right to vote. They risked harassment, intimidation, economics, and physical violence when they tried to register. So the result was that very few African Americans were registered voters. This is a very short history, a 3-minute history of voting rights.
In this scene from the 2012 movie, Abraham Lincoln spells out the terms of Reconstruction.
All they heard was the first time any president has ever made mention of Negro voting.
In 1865, he said freed slaves who were intelligent or had served as soldiers should be allowed to vote. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, guaranteed this right as part of the full citizenship accorded to African American men. But for much of the 20th century, voting remained a contentious issue. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, gave women the right to vote, but the racial divide remained. Some states continued to limit voting, either through measures like the poll tax or direct intimidation of African American voters. In the South, there were even whites-only primaries. This is Sam Tannenhouse of the New York Times. The first modern Civil Rights Act was signed by President Eisenhower in 1957. It created a federal commission authorized to enforce voting rights. Senator Strom Thurmond conducted the longest filibuster in history, more than 24 hours, in an effort to thwart the bill, but it passed.
The location for the meeting with Senator Rubicon.
Still, voting was not equal for all. Massive resistance in the Deep South was organized to keep blacks from the polls, and legal enforcement was hampered by all-white juries. Voting rights became a central issue in the civil rights movement.
I think this march will go down as one of the greatest.
In 1965, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. led the march from Selma to Montgomery for better voting laws. The nation was shocked by images of the marchers being attacked, and less than 5 months later, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It barred states and districts from curtailing the vote on the basis of race, color, or language.
It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country.
Sections 4 and 5 of the bill included special provisions to ensure fair voting practices in a number of states, most of them in the South. Voting rights advocates say some citizens there continue to be disenfranchised, but the Supreme Court's close ruling on Tuesday, striking down Section 4, suggests that conditions have changed since 1965, and it is left to Congress to reconsider the act.
So Ruth's dissent to that was very, very powerful. She used the analogy of getting rid of your umbrella in a rainstorm, just because the pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act was working. So you wouldn't want to, anyway, I'm trying to find that quote, but it's a great, great quote about your umbrella, needing your umbrella in a rainstorm. Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a knack for using, for translating complicated legal issues into framing it in a way that the general public could understand. The last ruling that she was a part of is this one around the extending the time to register in Wisconsin. Extending the time to register and to get your ballot in because of the pandemic. So this was one of her last rulings on voting rights. This is one of the memes that you'll see around I Dissent. She was famous for her collars. She had a gold collar that she wore when she was writing for the majority, and this silver kind of collar when she was dissenting. Our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, issued the following statement on September 18th following her death. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry. The late John Fitzgerald Kennedy once said, "While on earth, God's work must truly be our own. The sacred cause of liberty and justice, dignity and equality decreed by God and meant for all has been advanced because while on earth, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg made God's work her own. Because of her, the ancient words of the prophet Micah to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God have found fulfillment. May we follow in her footprints. May she rest in the arms of the God who is love and the author of true justice. Rest in peace, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Shalom. I'm going to invite Mary Adams now to talk about the current challenges to voting rights that we are facing.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you for inviting me today and for the just illuminating presentations that we've seen so far. Let's take a look at this picture. As we talk about the challenges to voting rights, I want you to just look at this picture and look at the faces, look at the beautiful smiles and the excitement that people had when they were finally able to get out to vote. Perhaps we could look at the next slide. There we go. Within hours of the Supreme Court overturned key divisions in the 1965 voting rights, we were finding ourselves going in the wrong direction. In North Carolina, where your former bishop now resides, she's changing everything. The GOP officials touted plans for new law that would curtail early voting, requiring IDs at polling places and end the same day registration. And all of those policies, of course, were being used because they would impact Black voters. But today, I want to tell you that we are celebrating the first ever National Early Voting Day. And today, at this point, more than 50 million people have already cast their ballots. I think it's a real testimony to the importance that people are now placing on early voting. For a number of reasons, it's important. First, it empowers you to draw others to the polls when you've already completed your responsibility. But secondly, it takes the pressure off the system. The earlier we're able to have votes counted, the more confidence we can have in the outcome. This year's vote is predicted to have more participation than any election since 1908. You can see what an important time this is for our country. And then going again, looking at what the suppression was, the efforts to suppress the vote is not new. This is something that we have heard about and known about just for so long, and it saddens me actually when we look at the efforts being made to suppress the vote today. And I must say that in part, of course, it's an effort to suppress the Black vote. I think as well to racial suppression, we're seeing other kinds of suppression as well, making it difficult for poorer people and people of all colors to be able to vote. It is a very difficult time that we face. In places like Georgia, thousands of voters, waited hours to be able to cast their ballot. Clearly, these are people who aspire to what the woman was quoted earlier, saying that my people have gone through too much not to exercise my right and my responsibility to vote. It's not known how many people are put off from voting because of the long lines in places like Georgia and other states that we've seen photos of in the media. But we do know that people are lining up. And it's very clear, once again, who it conveniences most. There was a survey done by MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, that found that on a whole, Black voters waited on average 16 minutes in line during the 2016 election, while white voters only waited 10 minutes. So clearly there is some prejudice there. When we were going through our presentation last evening, we came across the word, the naked ballots. And I think all three of us went, well, exactly what is a naked ballot? I don't think it had anything to do with what we were thinking. But at any rate, naked ballots, maybe I'd better explain what a naked ballot is before we go too far away here. This is a process where, this is started in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court, that ballots that were mailed without a secrecy envelope, hiding the identity of the voter, would be declared invalid. The decision, which was issued very shortly before the election in Pennsylvania, caused concern that significant number of naked ballots would be thrown away. So that's where naked ballots come from. And what's very difficult here, of course, is that before coronavirus, many states required you to have a mail-in ballot signed by a notary or witnesses. And of course, since the pandemic, many of those states have eased restrictions, but a handful of them still remain. I just look at this and I just think of how many people really would have the ability to find a notary. Yes, you can get a witness, perhaps, but just looking at once again, just one more difficulty in being able to exercise the vote. Another issue that's taking place that really limits people's ability to vote are the lack of places to vote, resulting in unbelievably long drives, especially in rural America. But as an example, there's a Native American group, voting rights group, that says that many Native Americans who live on reservations totally have limited access to voting. There are places where people have just one post office within every 700 square miles. And you can imagine how limiting that would be. In Nevada, as an example, the members of the Pyramid Paiutes have to drive almost 100 miles round trip to get to the closest early voting location. So clearly long drives is one of the ways that makes it very difficult. I think, however, in my opinion, one of the most difficult parts, though, are the identification laws. Since once people finally get through the long wait, first they've had to drive forever, then they've had to wait in lines forever, and now they have to prove that they are who they say they are. In 35 states, voters have to show some sort of an ID at the poll. And while some will allow a written affidavit if an ID is missing, a handful of states, primarily Wisconsin, Texas, Kansas, Indiana, Tennessee, Missouri, and Georgia, do not. So people, places like Wisconsin, where there's supporters of voter ID laws, passed one of the country's strictest voter ID laws in 2016, saying that it just makes it easy, but it makes it hard to cheat. Others say that fear of people voting in-person voting fraud are way overblown, and that people should not outweigh the harms caused by disenfranchising the poor, the homeless, the disabled voters, people who can't drive, and people who may not even have a permanent address. I think those are some of the most egregious parts of voter IDs. I know from just the same story that many of us have heard, is that there was a woman who was well into her 80s, who had no kind of ID. She didn't drive. She didn't have one of the special IDs. She'd voted in every election since she had been able to vote, and was denied her vote because she did not have an acceptable form of ID. Voter IDs laws have emerged in the last decade as part of a wider push by some Republican legislators, especially, ostensibly with the aim of curbing voter fraud. But there have been many studies that have been done that say that voter fraud is not an issue in the United States. However, they say that the law's real aim, of course, is to keep voters who are more likely to vote Democrat, like the young, poor, and African Americans, to stay at home. It's a common trope that everybody has an ID. You need to get an ID to get on an airplane, to open a bank account. But in truth, those of us who have worked in any kind of human service realize that there are many people who don't have bank accounts and who've never been on an airplane. So those are some of the people who are sadly disenfranchised. There is no widespread voter fraud in the United States. Research has shown that there is no widespread voter fraud. A commission was launched by the Trump administration to look into the 2016 election. However, it was disbanded without publishing a report. Roll purges are another way that people can control the vote, keep people from being able to vote. I know there's a case, I think it's before Wisconsin's top court, that could strike 130,000 names off the voter list. A conservative law firm has sued the state because the election commission did not immediately remove people from the list who had not responded within 30 days to a letter identifying them as someone who may have moved. I can tell you, going way back, this just clicked in my mind as I said this. Forgive me for getting off script a little bit, Linda, but I remember there was a television commercial when I was a little kid that said, if you have married, moved, or gone away since the last election day, you have to remember to go down and re-register to vote. But at any rate, the battle is split along partisan lines in Wisconsin that narrowly supported Trump in the 2016 election. Republicans saying that the commission failed to uphold the law by letting people stay on the rolls, while Democrats say the law disproportionately affects, once again, the young, the poor, and minority voters who may not have stable housing. Another way that challenges that voters face regard prison voting bans. And in California, we have a proposition on the ballot this year. It's Proposition 17 that will restore the right to vote to people who have completed their prison terms. And this means that they have completed their prison terms. It doesn't mean that they have had to fulfill any kind of outstanding lien or debt that they owe due to the crimes that they may have committed. That's not so. It's not the case in some other states that we know. As an example, I think it was in New York, where Mayor Bloomberg, who, as you know, ran for office for a short period of time, came through Monterey. I had the opportunity to meet with him at that time. He donated $16 million to help pay the fines and fees for 32,000 Black and Hispanic former felons. And he was doing this in the state of Florida. His donation, however, prompted the state's Republican Attorney General to ask the FBI to investigate it for potential violations of election laws. The next slide, please.
This is pulled from a Twitter account, and it's just the joy of these people who have. I think this is from Texas. They've stood in line for 11 hours in order to vote, but they are next.
Wow.
Yeah. So we just wanted to, the joy of the 1965 voting, and to show that people are really committed to voting in spite of challenges.
I think as well, this is a great picture to acknowledge Proposition 18 that's on our California state ballots this year, which amends the Constitution to permit 17-year-olds to vote in primaries and special elections if they are going to turn 18 by the time of the next general election. Let's see if we have one more slide here. I'm not sure if we do on this one.
Oh, yes, we do.
I'm so glad. I'm really happy to see this slide because it refers to a group that for whom I hold it in very high regard. In fact, just yesterday, I had the honor of presenting a county constitutional resolution acknowledging the existence of or congratulating the League of Women Voters on their 100-year anniversary. So they were founded the same year that women got the right to vote. So you can see, as the slide demonstrates, that after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the National American Suffrage Association became the National League of Women Voters. And their mission, of course, is the same today as it was then, to educate and inform about candidates who are running in the process of voting. It is a bipartisan group, but sadly, it represents a lot of the same problems that I'm seeing in what I believe are a lot of the civic groups, primarily for women. And that is that we are aging out. When I walk into a league meeting and I'm among one of the younger people, and I know how old I am, I think we've got a serious problem. And I believe that problem exists in some of the African-American women's groups as well, as we just look at them. It's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that we reach out to bring younger people into the political spectrum. Again, going back to, many people have worked too hard and have gone through too much for us not to really ensure that what we do today, as we stand on the shoulders of so many who have gone before us, is also setting the tone for what's going to be the future of our country, and the model that we need to bring forward is that it is important, and it is something that we have to instill in our grandchildren to ensure that people understand the importance of the role that they play in forming life for the rest of us, for generations to come. Thank you. I think that may have been the end of my slides and the end of my presentation. And
you're welcome to keep going, Mary. I just want us to be able to see one another.
Okay, thanks. That's okay. I think I finished everything that I should talk about as far as the challenges to voting. And we are the only ones who are going to be able to overcome this. Just as we had heard in some of the other comments that were made before, some of the beautiful quotes that we read, it's up to us. We must lift as we climb, and we must ensure that those who come behind us are able to continue to move forward. If we don't instill the importance, the love, and the need for our democracy and our ability to carry forward in the name of freedom, and the ability to vote is the single most important way to have your voice heard, I really question the future of our nation. So with that, I'll say once again, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. It's really an honor to have been here with these incredible women. So thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to ECW. I want to read a few of the chats from Barbara Schaefer. So far, the presentation has been wonderful and informative. I prefer to have no personal opinions about your politics. As speakers, you need to be bipartisan. Absolutely. This is a bipartisan issue. Everyone's voice counts, and everyone's voice is important. And in both the National League for Women, National League of Women Voters, all of this is for everyone. And some of us remember not being able to buy a house or get a credit card or take certain classes, asking if I was going to have children before I was hired. So some of us remember this. We see all of these color people. Let us not forget that our Native American people still have voting even today. And I think Mary was referring to that in these long, long drives on Native American reservations. So thank you. Notaries also cost money, another barrier for low income. And Winnie says from Sedona, this is one reason I came today, to honor my grandmother. Thank you. Let us all honor our ancestors because they sacrificed for us to be here. And with that, I'm going to ask Donna Elder, our deacon, if she will close us with a prayer.
If I might have the privilege, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. To say how grateful I am to be able to be in the company of all of you, because I think all of us have been through a lot of things that were mentioned today. And I hope in your hearts you now realize that you were right in those feelings that you had when you were denied credit as a married woman and had to get the credit in your husband's name. In the 1977 convention in Houston, which was supported by the national government, by the way, so that poor and wealthy women could come together, economic equality was considered. And I'm sure Ruth Bader Ginsburg was influenced by this huge group of people from throughout the United States that led that into the federal government. Because Betty Ford was there, Lady Bird Johnson was there, and Rosalind Carter was there, along with representatives from the Congress. So I just wanted to thank all of you for everything that you've been through and everything that you have done to continue this fight. And thank you so much for everything. And I found a poem, just a really short poem before my prayer. It's Japanese, from Joseph H. Mesmima. The truth is just like a plum blossom, dare to bloom despite wind and snow. And let us pray. Grant all of us, Lord, to spread true love in the world. Grant that by all of us, by our children and communities, that love may penetrate a little into all circles, all societies, all economic and political systems, all laws, all contracts, all rulings. Grant that it may penetrate into offices, factories, apartments, buildings, movie houses, dance halls. Grant that it may penetrate the hearts of everyone, and that all of us, every one of us, may never forget that the battle for a better world is a battle of love in the service of love. Amen and alleluia.
Amen and alleluia. Thank you. I want to thank again Episcopal Church Women, who is one of those organizations that always needs new leaders, right, Donna?
Oh, yeah.
And League of Women Voters, right, Mary, that we need new leaders there. And thank you so much to Theresa for contributing just a lovely, lovely segment.
Yes. Thank you all so much for coming. It's a great joy to see you all here. It's been a wonderful morning, I think. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
And the final thing is from Diane Lovelace, who is with Episcopal Church Women. Let us lift as we climb. Yes. Lift the whole, everyone. Men, women, of bipartisanly lift as we climb. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
The video will be posted. You can share it, and it will be posted on the same place where you found the link to get in today. And we'll make sure that the posting also goes over to ECW so they can share it.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah, Donna also posted a note that says if you would like to donate something for this presentation, this retreat, and all the wonderful things that we've learned and shared, there's a message in the chat to send it to Marge Smith, and her address is there. Thank you if you do that.
Great. We will post that on the website also.
Thank you.
All donations today that are coming to me as the leader are being donated to the League of Women Voters.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.